Hi folks, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to The Plot. I think it's fair to say that it's a commonly held belief that growing your own fruit and veg is a great way to save a bit of money. I recently ran the numbers on what it's cost me to convert this allotment and how much income I've earned in terms of harvests, and I was really surprised by the result. Now, people have been debating and discussing whether or not growing your own does save you money for years and years, and I don't pretend that I'm going to be able to put an end to that discussion today, but I think it will be really interesting to look at my personal finances, and as well I'll talk about things to watch out for if you're thinking about starting to grow your own, because there are quite a few hidden and surprising costs. And I should say as well that this video was inspired by Steve's Seaside Allotment. I'll put a link up here to his video. A lot of people are quite secretive about their finances, but he did a really good one all about his kind of costs and harvests. And costs, I think, is where we'll start. So when we start talking about costs, I think it's useful to use two categories. For me, the first, if you want to sound like a business person, you could call capital expenditure. These are the big purchases that you've got to kind of make up front to allow you to start growing. And then you've got annual or recurring expenses, the kind of things that you're going to have to buy every year. Seeds, compost, that kind of thing. We'll start with the capital expenditure and I'll whiz through all the things that I've spent money on. First up, we've got this greenhouse, which was technically free, but we did spend about £70 renting a van and transporting it. We've got these sleepers, which the greenhouse is sat on. Unfortunately, the greenhouse didn't come fully glazed. I had to spend quite a lot on these polycarbonate panels to fill the gaps. You won't get very far on an allotment without a wheelbarrow. I've had to buy a myriad of tools, such as this rake, a hoe, a mattock to get those stubborn bramble roots. There's a few things I have to keep at home in the shed because I don't want them getting nicked, and you'll need some loppers or something like this if you've got any big shrubs or trees on your plot. Now, I'm sure that most people won't need to buy one of these, but this was the only way that I was going to be able to get through those brambles. I had to invest a little bit of money into a wand sprayer and my favourite organic pesticide, neem oil, which I've done a video on that you can see up here. Things like seed cells and seed trays add up really quickly. Big and little plant pots add up really quickly as well. So those were my capital costs. It's worth noting that a lot of the things I've bought I will use for life around the house and other places in the garden as well. So they're not just for the allotment, but I've included them anyway because I had to buy them for the allotment. Now, it's worth noting that I got a lot of things for free when we took on the plot. So let's have a little chat about things that you should watch out for and things that you might need to buy. If you want to harvest your own water, you'll need some water butts. Some crops are basically impossible to grow without things like butterfly or insect netting. To prevent weeds growing on unused beds or to line the paths, people often use black plastic matting or Mypex, and you might want some of that. If you're going to be making your own compost, you'll need somewhere to do it. I've made these compost bays out of free pallets, but you can buy Dalek composters, big plastic black bins. And as well, you might want to think about buying in something like manure or topsoil. Because I live right on the south coast, I've got a really mild climate, which means I haven't had to spend any money on horticultural fleece, which is often very expensive and used to protect crops from late frosts. There's a whole load of small handheld tools that I use all the time, things like forks, dandelion weeders, secateurs, mystery thing, trowels, dibbers, forks and spades, all of which I found in the shed when we took this plot on, but could add up to a pretty penny. As you can see, I like the traditional method of just growing straight into the ground, but you might want to consider the cost of building raised beds. So they're all my capital expenses and the ones I think you should watch out for. Have I missed any? I'm sure I have. Let me know in the comments what you think I've missed and what you think is absolutely necessary for growing your own. Next, we move on to the annual costs, the recurring ones that we gotta spend every year. So the first and probably the most important annual expense I have is my plot rent. It varies massively depending on where you are in the country, but here we pay about £30 a year. Although I'm making a pretty good amount of homemade compost now, I still buy in bags for things that I'm growing in pots. Another thing to consider is fertilizer. You're probably going to want something above just compost to feed your plants, and I use blood, fish and bone quite a lot. There's lots of other alternatives for sort of balanced fertilizers, grow more, that kind of thing. I also tend to buy liquid fertilizer for my chilies and tomatoes, but realistically I probably spend less than £10 a year. A key annual expense, of course, is how much you're spending on your seeds every year. I think I'm quite frugal. In my first year, I spent about £18, and this year I've spent nothing at all. So I've got the costs here, and it's a quite staggering amount of money, actually. I had no idea it was anywhere close to this much. I thought maybe half as much, before I actually started pricing it up. But we've got about £520 capital, and then we've got annual costs of around 90. So we're hitting about 600 quid for this first year. And obviously the first year is very different from the rest, but that is a lot of money. And this was a particularly bad allotment, of course. But I did also get a lot of things for free. There were lots of things that I didn't have to buy. So for anyone else taking on a plot like this, maybe you wouldn't get the same free stuff. Maybe you wouldn't get a free greenhouse, potting benches, loads of tools. So it could potentially be even more expensive. Now we come to the really fun and quite tricky part of trying to estimate the harvest value. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. I've gone for the much more simple way, but another way that you see quite a lot is people comparing their crops with the kind of organic farm boxes that you would get. It's really popular at the moment. You can get kind of subscription to a veg box delivered, basically, and they're normally straight from organic farms, and they can be very pricey. You can also compare your harvest value against kind of organic fruit and veg from a greengrocer or something like that. But that isn't where I got my food from before I had the allotment. So for me, it would seem kind of disingenuous, and it would push those prices, the harvest value, way up if I did compare my harvest with kind of greengrocer prices or organic fruit and veg boxes. So I've done the more simple thing of just going on a supermarket website, looking at their price per unit or per kilogram, and I did go back and estimate how much I harvested in terms of weight or individual cabbages, for example. So it's not super accurate, but I was quite pleasantly surprised by the harvest amounts. So I'm not going to go through and talk about every single crop, but there are a few highlights and lowlights that I just want to talk about. And in here, I used to have all of my purple sprouting broccoli. You saw this earlier in the video under the netting, and hopefully I'm showing you some old clips now, but I had some amazing crops from here, some absolutely huge plants, and I reckon I got about 5 kilograms of broccoli. There were so many massive harvests, at least kind of 8 or 9 trugs full that I was bringing home. It was so prolific. And if you look at the supermarket value of about £8 a kilogram, I made a good 40 quid's worth of broccoli, which is insane. And the seeds cost me 99p. So we're looking at a margin there of £39. What a profit. Last summer, this part of the greenhouse is where I had my greenhouse tomatoes, and they were so prolific. I had a few other tomato plants on the plot as well, maybe 5 or 6, and I got so many tomatoes, and I estimate the value of those at around £20. Now, my next star of the show has to be these apple trees. I inherited 2 when I took on this plot. Obviously, they cost me nothing, but I had hundreds of apples. I had a wheelbarrow full. I would have loved to have made some cider or some preserves, but unfortunately we were moving house just as they cropped. So it's kind of umming and ahhing about whether I should include this, but there must have been at least 30 to 40 pounds worth of apple. Just here we see the remnant of the leek bed. I'm just waiting for this one to go to seed, but we had about 1/3 of a bed here given over to leeks, and I've never thought of those as a particularly expensive crop. But I think I made about £19 on my leeks, which was incredible. So I did make some money, but did I lose any money on any crops? Yes. One of those you see here, my very few tiny spring onions. Now these were planted in September. I spent about 50 pence on the seeds, and so far I've not had a single crop. So I've lost 50p. Because I still don't have any spring onions. And there were a couple of other things that I lost 20 or 30p on. The first is seed onions. I've got some germinating in the greenhouse at the moment. I did get a pretty decent crop, but it didn't quite match up to the cost of the seeds. And cabbages was the other one. I only got about 2 cabbages, so they didn't quite cover the cost of the seeds. So overall, it was pretty successful, but there's lots and lots of caveats. So the next part is kind of a discussion about all of this. So is growing your own fruit and veg a good way of saving you money? Well, we've run the numbers on this plot and it's a complicated answer. In terms of harvest value, I reckon about £200. And I think that's on the lower end. We could have estimated a lot higher. When you subtract the annual costs, we've made about £100. And then when you subtract the capital costs, the investment, we're down £500, which is not a small amount of money. But in 5 years, if I carried on managing the plot and getting the same kind of harvests, we would just about break even. So I don't think it is a very good way of saving you money if you had a plot like this. But there are so many elements to discuss. And the first is the fact that I am a complete beginner. This was my first year. I made loads and loads of beginner mistakes. There are loads of things I could have done more cheaply as well. And as time goes on, hopefully, I will become a much better and more efficient gardener. I'll get better crops, and potentially, as I learn which crops are the best at saving me money, I might start to plant a few more of those. Another thing we really have to consider is highlighted by my leeks here. I grew and ate more leeks this winter than probably I have in the rest of my life combined. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but sure, leeks were one of my most profitable crops, but for me, that's not really a profit because I wouldn't normally have been spending anywhere near £20 a year on my leeks. And the same is true for a few of the other crops. I wouldn't have spent that much on purple sprouting broccoli. I wouldn't have bought a wheelbarrow full of apples. So that's just something to keep in mind. In the interest of full transparency, because I do want to be honest about this, I haven't included the costs that I spend on my peppers. If you follow the channel, you'll know that I have an awful lot of chili peppers growing, and I probably spend a lot of money on seed and specific products like fertilizers or soil amendments for these guys. If I included the harvest weight of chili peppers at UK supermarket prices, the figure would be astronomical. I probably make a gigantic profit on peppers, but I don't really think it's realistic. So one really key part that's missing from all of these calculations and from this question really, I think, is the element of labor cost. Everything I've done on this plot has been for free. I have spent hours and hours converting it. And of course, I love doing it. That's why I do it. But if you were to factor in labor cost, even if you only paid me £1 per hour, these figures would skew so far towards a colossal loss of money. If you're really concerned about your budget and you're in a poverty situation, growing your own fruit and vegetables will do very, very little to help you. You are far better off taking a couple of extra days work on a weekend or a Saturday, and you would make as much money as I've made in a whole year working on this plot. So for me, I think of gardening as a hobby. It's something that brings me joy and makes me happy. But it was really interesting running these numbers, and I was really, really pleasantly surprised. It made me feel really good to know that I'd harvested like £200 worth of food from such a relatively small area in such a small amount of time, especially considering what it looked like at the start. But for me, when we ask the question of whether or not it's worthwhile growing your own fruit and veg, the answer isn't about the profit or loss. It's not about money. It's about whether or not you enjoy it. And I think most people who clicked this video already knew the answer to whether or not it's worth it. Because if you hate doing it, yeah, you might be able to save yourself 5 or 10 quid, like a year. And maybe if you're really, really efficient and you've been growing for years, you can make a really good profit. But that's probably not why you do it. You probably do it because, like me, you love doing it. And that's what's really important, I think. But what do you think? I'm really interested to hear from everyone in the comments below what you think I missed. Are there any big costs? Are there any things that you would never spend money on, which I have? Do you ever do this exercise? Do you weigh up the costs and harvests? Let me know. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you again next time.